Apache Web Server, MySQL, Alfresco, Jaspersoft, and what have you. Now, talking about making open source sustainable, there's an important event that happened in history. Well, there are many important events, but one I want to point to that doesn't necessarily get recognized as much. So let us look at the timeline, a short timeline of open source here. So it was free software, of course, but let me start here with Linux 1991. Developed nicely. In 1998, the Open Source Initiative was founded. This was all for open source projects, but developers came together, enjoyed what they did, and the way they interacted was regulated by the license, but it was still the individual developers who were legally responsible for the software. And that is a problem for sustainability, because as an individual developer, if some company is using my software or software that I contributed to, I wouldn't want to get sued because something goes wrong. So the important event, or of the many important events, the one I want to point out is the creation of the open source foundations with I didn't put the Free Software Foundation here, but the Apache Software Foundation 1999 and 2004, the Eclipse Foundation. And the Apache Software Foundation was founded based on the recognition that the Apache web server was becoming such an important commercially relevant piece of software that it needed more sustainability, that it needed more organizational backing than the group of developers. So they created a non-profit organization that is holding the intellectual property rights, that makes the software defensible in court if someone comes along and wants to sue the project or the developers who developed the project. So there was a switch from the loosely coupled set or group of developers to a non-profit organization that provides protection to the projects in 1999. I call it the switch from traditional community open source to a managed community open source. It's community open source because it's many different stakeholders, many different developers from many different companies, even though in the case of the open source foundations, the rights have been transferred to that foundation. Because the foundations are run by their members, it's still community open source. And then there are many different open source foundations by now. So the Eclipse Foundation is probably well known. It is structured quite differently for different intents. I hesitate to say it because the Eclipse Foundation doesn't like it, but it has some properties of a traditional industry consortium. There are quite significant differences in the governance of these foundations, and it implies what projects can be run there, how you cope with competition, etc., and how freedom is preserved. Almost completely independent of this community open source, driven by volunteer developers, was what I called initially commercial open source, and more specifically now called single vendor open source, because it's open source projects where a single company has started the project, is developing the project, and is going to market with it. The primary case for that is MySQL, the database. 1995, the company was founded. 2001, the company got venture capital funding. And living in the Silicon Valley, I saw it play out 2001 to 2005, 2006. The venture capitalist went out, specifically looked for enterprise application software where there was a chance to disrupt the existing vendors through an open source go-to-market strategy, which I'll be addressing in a bit. Just because you get software under an open source license doesn't mean it's completely free. There are lots and lots of ways of how you control software. It's not just copyright it's not just a license which shares some rights with you. Of course, the IP, the intellectual property rights, are core aspects of it. So the license regulates, leaves the copyright with the developers, but gives you certain rights. But you also need to cover trademarks and patents, and some of the better licenses do that. And that's also why the foundations were founded, because they require transfer or rights assignment. But beyond that, you can block projects by not letting anyone share in it. If you don't give people right access, it's just not a community effort. And that's playing out all over the place. The governance rules by which you can keep people out. There are simple, basic things like domain ownership, how you keep mind share, even if you're not really even if by the book you do open source, but not by the spirit. So the second key dimension here is how open is your development. Open source foundations like Apache, the Apache web server, always were open in that anyone could join. If you proved you're a good developer, you would be let in. And then your code contributions they would be accepted, but eventually you would actually get the rights to change the source code base. So this is important. You don't get the right to change the source code of a project just from the beginning. You have to prove you're good, so you provide some contributions, but you cannot put them into the project. You have to send them to a so-called committer, someone who actually has the right rights for the project. There's a two-layer society in open source, where there are people who contribute, and then those who do quality assurance and either keep your contribution in or out. So in open development, you just provide contributions. Eventually, people will recognize you're so good, they'll just let you write directly to the project. So you made it into the core of the project. That's kind of, in simplifying terms, open development. That's not what, for example, MySQL does. MySQL, there's no chance to contribute to the code base of the database project directly. They will not allow it. They don't allow it because they want to maintain complete control over the code base. MySQL, the company, now Oracle, owns all the copyright, and they want it that way because it helps them with the business strategy that we'll be talking about in a bit. And that's what most single vendor open source does. They control the development, and it's very much closed development like in closed source as well. There's some other variations where they're like open source consortia, which are really community open source, but they haven't opened up development yet. They only let the participating companies develop, not any random developer. But mostly that is because they haven't quite figured out the open source development process yet. So I believe one consortium I dealt with is the Gen IVI, the infotainment, the in-vehicle infotainment. That's what the car companies do. Like they want to run Linux in the console, and so it's the radio and your iPod you can plug in and the navigational device and what have you. That's all a Linux stack, or is going to be a Linux stack. They do not accept volunteer contributions because it's the companies who develop it, and they want to keep it that way for now until they figure out how they can move from the upper rightmost quadrant to the leftmost quadrant eventually. There are really two sweet spots when you look at ownership versus openness. If you're community owned, you want open development. If you're commercially owned and you want to maintain control, you want closed development. So you don't let anyone contribute, because otherwise you would lose your rights to the software and your right to play out various business strategies. So in that space, let me first focus on community open source, because in some sense it has the highest impact on public welfare. Why, when you look at the Apache web server or Linux, it's actually not volunteers any longer who do most of the development. It's the companies. It's IBM, it's Tata, it's many others who contribute. So why would a commercially motivated company contribute to an open source software project where everyone can get it for free? Well, they play various games, one of which is simply that they may not be making money directly on the project they are contributing to, but they are making money off complementary products. So for example, I'm strongly simplifying the economics here, of course, but to illustrate my point, let's assume there's a closed source situation where you're a business application vendor and which has to use a closed source operating system. If you're selling a business application, you'd love if there are no license fees to be paid for the closed source for the operating system, because then more money is left over in the customer's wallet to be spent on the business application and more modules or more functionality on the business application.